The thing wearing my hiking partner's face smiled too wide when it asked if I had any extra water. Tyler was 300 yards behind me on the trail, and he'd been dead for 2 hours. I should back up. Tyler and I had been hiking together for 8 years. Same college, same hometown, same stupid habit of picking trails that looked easy on paper and turned into all-day slogs. We'd planned this trip to Pisgah National Forest 3 weeks out, just a simple day hike on the Art Lobe Trail near Black Balsam Knob. October weather, clear forecast, nothing complicated. We left Asheville at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Tyler brought his usual gear: Lou Gregory pack, worn Merrill boots, that faded red ball cap he'd had since sophomore year. I packed my standard load: a paper map in a Ziploc, first aid kit, bear spray, 2 liters of water, trail mix. We signed the register at the Black Balsam parking area at 9:15 and started north on the trail. The first hour went exactly like we'd planned. Cool air, decent footing, views opening up across the Blue Ridge. We kept our normal pace, steady but not rushed, stopping every 20 minutes to check the map and mark our progress. Tyler was in good spirits, making his usual jokes about my paranoid habit of counting trail markers and noting landmarks. At mile marker 3, the trail splits. The main Art Lobe continues north toward Tennant Mountain. A side trail drops east toward a creek crossing and some old campsites. Tyler wanted to check out the creek for photos. I said I'd push ahead to the next ridge and wait for him at the overlook. We'd done this kind of split before. Standard protocol: stay on marked trails, check in every 30 minutes, meet at the predetermined spot. I gave Tyler my satellite communicator. His phone battery was getting low, and the creek area was a dead zone for cell service anyway. We synchronized our watches. 11:45 a.m. He'd take the side trail, spend 20 minutes at the creek, then backtrack to the main trail and catch up with me at the overlook. Simple plan. I continued north on Art Lobe. The trail climbs steadily through rhododendron thickets and then opens onto a bald ridge with long views west. I reached the overlook at 12:10 p.m. and set my pack against a trail marker post. Clear day, visibility for miles, perfect conditions for photos. I ate half my sandwich and waited. 12:45. No Tyler. I wasn't worried yet. Creek crossings take time, and Tyler liked to move slowly when he was shooting. I gave it another 15 minutes, then started back down the trail to find him. I found Tyler's red cap first. It was caught on a laurel branch about 10 yards off the main trail, near where the side trail junction should have been. The fabric was torn along the bill. I called his name. No answer. I pushed through the brush toward where I thought the creek trail started. That's when I found Tyler's pack. It was sitting upright against a tree, zippers open, contents scattered in a rough circle. Water bottle, camera, extra layer, trail snacks, all arranged on the ground like someone had been taking inventory. The satellite communicator was there too, screen cracked, GPS function dark. I called Tyler's name again, louder this time. The echo came back clean from the ridges. No human sound, no response. I checked my watch. 1:15 p.m. He'd been gone an hour and a half. I followed what looked like a game trail toward the sound of running water. The underbrush got thicker, and I had to push through stands of mountain laurel that grabbed at my jacket. The terrain dropped sharply toward a narrow creek that ran over smooth granite slabs. I found Tyler at the bottom of a 15-foot drop, wedged between 2 boulders where the creek makes a sharp turn. His neck was bent at an angle that told me everything I needed to know without checking for a pulse. His eyes were open, staring up through the canopy. No movement, no breath fog in the cool air. I'd seen enough hunting accidents to recognize death when it's final. The rock face above showed scuff marks where his boots had lost purchase. Wet granite, steep angle, probably grabbed for a handhold that wasn't there. The kind of accident that happens fast and doesn't give you time to think your way out of it. I climbed down and checked anyway. No pulse at his wrist. No reaction to light in his pupils. His skin was already losing heat. I estimated time of death somewhere around noon, based on core temperature and the way the blood had pooled in his lower extremities. Tyler had been dead for over an hour. That's when I heard my name called from up the trail. Tyler's voice, same tone he always used when he was ready to get moving. "Let's go, man." Daylight's burning. I looked up from the creek. Tyler was standing on the main trail about 50 yards away, wearing his red cap, blue pack on his shoulders. He waved with his left hand, the same casual gesture he'd used 1,000 times. I looked down at Tyler's body, then back up at the trail. The figure was still there, still waving. Same height, same build, same red cap. But Tyler's red cap was hanging from the laurel branch where I'd found it, and Tyler's body was cooling between the boulders at my feet. I didn't call out. I didn't wave back. I climbed out of the creek bed and moved toward the main trail, keeping trees between me and whatever was wearing Tyler's face. When I reached the junction, the figure was gone. I heard footsteps on the trail ahead, steady and measured, keeping just out of sight around the next bend. I followed at a distance, moving quietly on the leaf litter, staying close to the edge where my boots wouldn't ring on stone. Every 100 yards or so, Tyler's voice would call back, "Come on, slowpoke, you're falling behind." The voice was perfect. Same inflection, same rhythm, same words Tyler had used on a dozen trails. But Tyler was dead in the creek, and this thing was leading me deeper into the forest. At mile marker 5, it stopped and waited. I held back in the tree line and watched. The figure stood with its back to me, hands at its sides, weight shifted to one hip the way Tyler always stood when he was checking his phone. But it held the position too long, too still, like a photograph instead of a living person. When it turned around, the face was Tyler's face. Same brown eyes, same crooked smile, same small scar on the chin from a childhood fall. But the smile was too wide. The corners of the mouth pulled back farther than human anatomy allows, and the eyes didn't track together when it looked in my direction. "Hey," it said in Tyler's voice. "You got any extra water? I'm feeling pretty dry." Tyler never asked for water. He was obsessive about hydration, always carried more than he needed, always offered to share with me when my bottles ran low. In 8 years of hiking together, he had never once asked me for water. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on its face. The smile got wider, showing too many teeth. The head tilted at an angle that made my stomach clench. It took one step toward me, then another, moving with Tyler's gait, but without Tyler's natural rhythm. "Where are you going?" it asked. "We're not done hiking yet." I turned and ran, not jogging, not fast walking. Full sprint back toward the parking area. I stayed on the main trail, counting markers as they passed, focusing on the sound of my own breathing and the slap of my boots on packed dirt. Behind me, I heard steady footsteps keeping pace, never gaining, never falling back. I reached the parking area at 2:45 p.m. My truck was where I'd left it, dusty and ordinary and real. I fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and pulled out fast enough to spray gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the lot, still wearing Tyler's face, still smiling too wide. I drove straight to the Pisgah Ranger District Office in Brevard and reported a hiking fatality. I gave them the location, the GPS coordinates from my phone, and a description of the accident scene. I didn't mention the thing that looked like Tyler. I stuck to facts. My hiking partner had fallen from wet granite, sustained fatal injuries, and his body was located at the creek crossing below the Art Loeb Trail Junction. The search and rescue team found Tyler's body exactly where I'd described. The recovery took 3 hours because of the terrain and the need to document the scene. The Transylvania County Sheriff's Office ruled it an accidental death. Loss of footing on wet rock. Impact trauma. No signs of foul play. The case file lists me as the reporting witness and includes my statement about finding the body. What the file doesn't include is what I saw afterward. The ranger who led the recovery team mentioned that they'd found Tyler's pack contents scattered near the trail junction, but they'd assumed scavengers had gotten into his food. When I asked about the red cap, he said they hadn't found one. He suggested it might have blown away or been carried off by wildlife. I drove home with Tyler's death certificate and a copy of the incident report. That night, I called Tyler's parents and told them about the accident. I kept it simple. A fall, quick death, no suffering. I didn't mention the scattered gear, or the missing cap, or the thing that had worn his face and asked me for water. Tyler's funeral was the following Saturday. Open casket, family service, the usual gathering of friends and relatives sharing memories. I sat in the back and listened to stories about Tyler's kindness, his sense of humor, his love of the outdoors. When people asked me about the accident, I gave them the same basic facts I'd given the authorities. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the way that thing moved when it thought I wasn't looking. The unnatural stillness, the too wide smile, the head tilted at impossible angles. And I think about Tyler's voice calling my name from the trail, leading me deeper into the woods, asking me for water with words Tyler would never have said. I still hike. I go out every few weeks, usually solo now, always with emergency gear and a GPS beacon. I stick to popular trails with good cell service and regular foot traffic. I don't camp overnight, and I don't push into remote areas where help is far away, and I don't split up with hiking partners anymore. If someone wants to take a side trail or check out a creek crossing, we go together or we skip it entirely. Because I learned something in Pisgah that no safety course teaches you. Sometimes the person calling your name from the trail isn't the person you think it is. Sometimes the familiar voice asking for help belongs to something that studied your friend's habits, memorized their speech patterns, and put on their face like a mask. If you hike with partners, stay together. If you hear someone calling your name from an unexpected direction, verify their location before you answer. And if your hiking buddy asks you for something they've never asked for before, something that doesn't match 8 years of shared experience, trust your instincts over your eyes. Tyler died from a climbing accident on wet granite. That's what the death certificate says, and it's what I told his family. But the thing that wore his face and smiled too wide, that's still out there somewhere, walking the trails, learning new voices, practicing new faces, waiting for the next person who splits off from their partner and disappears into the brush. Don't be that person. Stay on the main trail. Keep your group together. And if something starts feeling wrong, if your friend starts acting just a little bit off, get back to your vehicle and drive away. You can sort out hurt feelings later. You can't sort out being dead. That's the whole lesson. That's all I've got. And if this story keeps even one person from making the same mistake Tyler and I made, then maybe sharing it was worth reliving the worst day of my life. Because somewhere out there, that thing is still waiting, still learning, still wearing faces that don't belong to it. And the next time you see it, it might be wearing yours. If you've experienced something similar on the trails, or if this story helped you stay safe during your own adventures, I'd appreciate hearing about it in the comments. Share your experiences, look out for each other, and remember that the wilderness doesn't always follow the rules we think we understand. Sometimes the best thing you can do is trust your gut, stick with your group, and get back to civilization while you still can. The ranger who knocked on my cabin door at 2 a.m. had my brother's voice, my brother's uniform, and my brother's face. I just watched my brother burn alive in the forest fire 20 minutes earlier. I need to start from the beginning because none of this makes sense without the context. I'd rented a cabin in the Shoshone National Forest for 2 weeks in late August, planning to finish a writing project away from distractions. The place was 40 miles southeast of Cody, Wyoming, accessible by a dirt road that wound through dense lodgepole pine and aspen groves, remote enough for quiet, close enough to civilization that I could drive to town for supplies when I needed them. My brother Nathan worked as a forest ranger for the Shoshone district. He'd helped me find the rental through contacts in the service, a small A-frame cabin owned by a retired couple who only rented it out a few times per year. Nathan had the keys, knew the access road like the back of his hand, and promised to check on me every few days during fire season. He'd been working these mountains for 12 years, knew every trail and creek and ridge between Yellowstone and the Wind River Range. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking Pahaska Creek, surrounded by forest on 3 sides with a clear view west toward the Absaroka Range. 1 bedroom, basic kitchen, wood stove for heat, solar panels for minimal electricity, no cell service, but a landline phone connected to the local exchange in case of emergencies. Perfect setup for 2 weeks of uninterrupted work. Exactly what I needed to finish the book I'd been struggling with for months. Nathan stopped by on my 4th day there, driving his Forest Service truck up the winding access road just as the sun was setting behind the peaks. He looked exhausted. Red eyes. 3 days of stubble. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from fighting fires in 90-degree heat with no real sleep. Fire season had been brutal that year. 3 major blazes burning simultaneously across the district. Crews stretched so thin they were pulling resources from other forests just to maintain basic suppression efforts. He sat on the cabin's small porch drinking coffee while I made lunch, and we talked about the fires, the weather patterns, the hot, dry conditions that had turned everything into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. He showed me the burn maps on his tablet, explaining the containment lines and evacuation zones with the practiced patience of someone who'd given the same briefing dozens of times. The nearest active fire was 8 miles northeast, burning toward the Sunlight Basin but moving away from my area at a predictable rate. "If anything changes," Nathan said, adjusting his worn baseball cap against the afternoon glare. "If you smell smoke or see aircraft overhead, call the district office immediately. Don't wait for an official evacuation order. These things can shift direction faster than most people understand." He gave me his radio frequency and all the emergency numbers, wrote them on a piece of paper in his careful handwriting and taped it next to the landline. Standard precautions, nothing that suggested immediate danger. The cabin was well outside any evacuation zones, situated on high ground with multiple exit routes and defensible space cleared around the structure. Nathan wouldn't have let me stay if he thought there was any real risk to my safety. That was Tuesday afternoon. Nathan left around 3 p.m., promising to check back on Friday if conditions remained stable. I spent the next 2 days writing, taking breaks to walk the ridge trail that connected to the greater trail system, photographing wildlife and trying to clear my head when the words wouldn't come. The air was hazy from distant smoke, but nothing concerning. Just the usual summer conditions during fire season. I could hear helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft in the distance throughout the day, part of the ongoing suppression efforts that had become background noise over the past week. Friday morning brought a dramatic wind shift that changed everything in the span of a few hours. I woke to the smell of smoke, not the faint haze I'd grown used to over the past few days, but the sharp, acrid scent of nearby burning, thick enough to make my eyes water. I stepped onto the porch and saw a towering column of black smoke rising from the northeast, much closer than it had been on Tuesday. Much, much closer. I called the district office on the landline immediately. The woman who answered sounded harried, phones ringing constantly in the background, voices coordinating resources and personnel. She told me there'd been a major flare-up overnight, wind-driven spot fires jumping containment lines and establishing new perimeters faster than crews could respond. She took down my exact location from the GPS coordinates Nathan had provided and said someone would be in touch within the hour with updated information. She advised me to pack essential items immediately and be ready to leave on short notice if conditions deteriorated further. By noon, the smoke had thickened to the point where I couldn't see the ridgeline to the east, and ash was falling like gray snow on the cabin's metal roof. The air tasted of char and pine resin, thick enough that I had to breathe through a damp cloth when I stepped outside. I packed methodically. Laptop and external drives first, then important papers, identification, insurance documents, family photos. I filled a go bag with clothes and toiletries, loaded my car with everything I couldn't afford to lose, and made sure I had full tanks of gas in both the car and the generator. The landline rang every 30 minutes with automated updates about fire conditions, road closures, and evacuation procedures. Each message was more urgent than the last. Spot fires spreading rapidly due to wind conditions. Multiple evacuations in progress. Aircraft grounded due to heavy smoke and turbulence. I should have left right then. Should have loaded the car and driven straight to Cody without waiting for official word. But Nathan had said he'd check on me, and I kept thinking I'd wait another hour, give him time to arrive and assess the situation professionally. At 1:15 p.m., I heard the rumble of heavy engines on the access road. Diesel trucks climbing the steep grade in low gear. 2 Forest Service vehicles appeared through the smoke, emergency lights flashing red and blue against the haze. Nathan was driving the lead truck, a heavy-duty pickup equipped with water tanks and suppression gear. Behind him was another ranger I didn't recognize, driving a larger crew transport vehicle loaded with equipment. They parked near the porch and climbed out wearing full wildfire gear, yellow Nomex pants and long-sleeved shirts, hard hats with reflective tape, heavy leather boots caked with ash and mud. Nathan's face was streaked with soot, eyes bloodshot from smoke exposure, voice hoarse when he called out. "Time to go," he said, his usual calm demeanor replaced by controlled urgency. "Fire jumped Pahaska Creek about an hour ago. It's moving this direction faster than we anticipated. We've got maybe 20 minutes before this ridge becomes indefensible." The other ranger introduced himself as Tom Bradley from the Cody station, a tall guy with graying temples and the steady movements of someone who'd been fighting fires for decades. He helped me load my gear into my car while Nathan spread detailed topographical maps across the hood of his truck, studying evacuation routes and comparing them to real-time reports crackling over his radio. They were calculating drive times to safety zones, identifying potential bottlenecks, planning for contingencies I didn't want to think about. "Main access road still clear for now," Nathan said, tracing a route with his finger. "But we need to move immediately. Wind's pushing the fire directly toward this drainage, and once it reaches the ridge, this whole area will be compromised. The cabin, the trees, everything." I threw the last of my gear into my car, locked up the cabin knowing I might never see it again, and prepared to follow the 2 Forest Service trucks down the winding dirt road that had seemed so peaceful just a week earlier. In my rearview mirror as we pulled away, I could see orange glow pulsing through the smoke behind us, much brighter and closer than it had been just an hour earlier. We drove in convoy formation, Nathan leading me in the middle, Bradley bringing up the rear with his emergency lights strobing continuously. 3 miles down the access road, Nathan's truck stopped abruptly at what should have been a routine creek crossing. He climbed out and walked back to my car, gesturing for me to roll down the window. His expression was grim, jaw set in the way it got when he was working through a serious problem. "Bridge is out," he said, pointing ahead to where the small concrete structure had been. Flash flood last week during that big storm took out the entire culvert. Water carved a channel too deep and too wide for vehicles to cross safely. "We'll have to find another way out." He pointed to a rough track that branched left from the main road, barely visible through the dense timber and nearly overgrown with brush. "Emergency fire road," he explained. Connects to Highway 14 about 8 miles south through some rough country. It's a longer route, steep in places, but it's our only remaining option at this point. The fire road was exactly what it sounded like. A narrow dirt track cut through the forest for emergency access, steep grades and tight switchbacks, barely wide enough for one vehicle at a time, built for small firefighting vehicles and emergency crews, not for civilian evacuation. Nathan's truck led the way, emergency lights strobing continuously through the thickening smoke. I stayed close behind, fighting the steering wheel on loose gravel turns, trying not to think about what would happen if my sedan broke down or got stuck on this remote track. 2 miles into the fire road, the route forked at an unmarked junction. Nathan stopped again, this time consulting his GPS unit and radio, trying to raise dispatch through the heavy smoke and mountainous terrain that was interfering with communications. I could hear fragmented chatter from other units, reports of spot fires, road closures, evacuation routes being compromised faster than crews could respond. The situation was changing by the minute, and our options were shrinking rapidly. Nathan walked back to my car again, his face more troubled than before. "Left fork's completely blocked," he said. "Maintenance crew reported a massive tree down across the road this morning, plus debris from a rock slide. They're working to clear it, but that's going to take hours we don't have. We're going right, up and over Pine Ridge. It connects to a ranch access road that should get us to the highway. The right fork climbs steeply through increasingly dense timber, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that had been stressed by drought and were perfect fuel for the approaching fire. The road surface deteriorated rapidly from graded dirt to loose rock and exposed tree roots, the kind of terrain that really required four-wheel drive and experienced mountain driving. My sedan wasn't built for this kind of punishment, but I kept it moving, following Nathan's taillights through the smoke that was getting thicker with every mile. That's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Nathan's truck disappeared around a sharp curve about 100 yards ahead of me, and I heard his engine rev as he tried to power through what sounded like a difficult section. Then came the grinding crash of metal on rock, the screech of tearing steel, and the sudden silence that follows when an engine stops running unexpectedly. I came around the curve and saw the aftermath. Nathan's truck nosed down in a deep washout that hadn't been visible until the last second. Front axle clearly broken, steam and smoke rising from the crumpled radiator. The vehicle was completely disabled, no question about it. I stopped and ran to the truck, adrenaline overriding everything else. Nathan was conscious, but trapped, his left leg pinned under the collapsed dashboard, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the steering wheel during the impact. His breathing was shallow and rapid, skin pale beneath the soot and sweat. Bradley's truck was nowhere to be seen. Either he'd taken a different route at the last junction or gotten separated somehow in the chaos and heavy smoke. "Radio," Nathan gasped, pointing weakly toward his belt. "Call for help." I grabbed the portable radio from his utility belt and tried desperately to raise the dispatcher, cycling through all the emergency frequencies Nathan had taught me. But the mountainous terrain and heavy smoke were blocking transmission completely. Nothing but static filled the channel no matter which frequency I tried. My cell phone showed no service bars, same as it had for the entire past week in this remote location. Nathan's condition was deteriorating visibly. His skin was getting more pale by the minute, pulse weak and rapid, classic signs of internal bleeding and shock setting in. He needed immediate medical attention, advanced trauma care, but the nearest hospital was more than 40 miles away through mountain roads, and we were trapped on a fire road with no communication and no way to call for help. That's when I noticed the orange glow brightening through the trees around us. The main fire had crested the ridge behind us and was racing down the drainage in our direction, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I could hear it now, the deep rumbling roar of massive combustion, trees exploding as superheated sap boiled and ignited. the steady rushing sound of superheated air being drawn into the fire like a giant bellows. The temperature around us was rising noticeably, and we had minutes at most before the fire reached our position. I tried desperately to pull Nathan from the wreckage, but his leg was completely pinned under the collapsed dashboard panel. The front end of the truck had compressed during the impact, and I couldn't get any leverage to lift the heavy steel. Nathan was fully conscious and alert, and he understood our situation as well as I did. He'd fought enough fires to know exactly what was coming. "You have to go," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Get out of here right now. I'm not leaving you here," I said, still pulling futilely at the dashboard. "You have to," he insisted. "Fire's moving too fast. You can't help me by dying here too. That won't accomplish anything." The heat was becoming intense. Waves of superheated air washing over us like opening an oven door. Spot fires were igniting in the canopy directly above us, raining burning debris onto the road surface. My car was only 15 feet away, engine still running, driver's door standing open. I could reach it in 3 seconds and drive out ahead of the main firewall, but that meant abandoning Nathan to burn alive. "Go," he said again, more forcefully. "Tell Mom and Dad what happened. Tell them I was doing my job, helping people evacuate safely. Tell them I didn't suffer. I made the hardest decision of my life. I ran to my car and drove away, not because I was brave or because it was the right moral choice, but because staying would have meant we both died without accomplishing anything useful. I drove through smoke so thick I couldn't see the road surface, following the rough track by memory and instinct, pushing my sedan harder than it was designed to handle, listening to rocks and debris scraping against the undercarriage. Behind me, the forest erupted into an inferno. I saw the fireball in my rearview mirror as the main blaze reached Nathan's truck, a brilliant orange explosion that lit up the entire smoke column like a massive flare. The roar was audible even over my straining engine, a sound like jet aircraft and breaking glass combined, the sound of a forest dying all at once. Somehow, I made it to the ranch access road and then to Highway 14, where I flagged down a Wyoming highway patrol trooper who was coordinating traffic around fire road closures. Within an hour, the area was swarming with emergency responders, fire suppression crews, paramedics, incident commanders coordinating resource deployment from mobile command posts, but there was no rescue mission for Nathan. The fire had moved through that drainage like a freight train, consuming everything organic in its path at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The access road, the washout where his truck had crashed, Nathan's body, all of it was now blackened ground covered in ash, too hot for recovery teams to approach safely. The incident commander told me they'd recover any remains once the area cooled sufficiently, probably sometime the following week. I gave detailed statements to the highway patrol trooper, the incident commander, a Forest Service investigator, and an insurance adjuster. Line of duty death, they called it. Ranger Nathan Mills killed in vehicle accident during wildfire evacuation operations while attempting to escort civilians to safety. They took my contact information and said someone would follow up with additional questions as the investigation proceeded. I drove to Cody in a daze and checked into a motel, too emotionally and physically shaken to attempt the long drive home. I called my parents and told them what had happened. Struggled through the same conversation with Nathan's girlfriend, his supervisor, his closest friends from the Forest Service. Same basic story each time. Accident on a fire road. Truck disabled in a washout. Nathan trapped. Fire moving too fast for any rescue attempt to be feasible. The Sunset Inn was one of those old motor courts from the 1950s. Individual cabins arranged in a horseshoe around a gravel parking lot. I got a ground floor room facing the lot, paid cash for 3 nights, and tried to process what had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying the scene over and over, wondering if I'd made the right choice. If there was something else I could have tried, some way I could have freed Nathan from that wreckage before the fire arrived, I'd watched my brother burn to death, and I'd driven away to save my own life. The rational part of my mind understood it was the only logical option, that staying would have accomplished nothing except getting us both killed. But rational understanding doesn't help much when you're carrying that kind of psychological weight, when you're dealing with survivor's guilt and the image of someone you love dying alone in agony. At exactly 2 a.m., someone knocked on my cabin door. I say cabin, but I mean my motel room at the Sunset Inn. I was staying in Unit 7, ground floor room with a view of the parking lot and the highway beyond. But in my exhausted, half-asleep state, disoriented by grief and stress, the knock sounded exactly like it was coming from the cabin door. The A-frame I'd evacuated what felt like a lifetime ago, but had actually been less than 15 hours. I got up and looked through the peephole, expecting to see another guest or maybe the night manager. Instead, I saw a Forest Service ranger standing in the hallway under the dim porch light, wearing standard wildfire suppression gear, holding an official-looking clipboard. He had the same build as Nathan, same height and general proportions, same way of standing with his weight shifted slightly to one hip, but the lighting was poor, and I couldn't make out his facial features clearly through the fisheye lens. "Emergency evacuation assistance," the ranger called through the door. His voice was professional but urgent. "We need to get you relocated to a designated safe zone immediately." The voice was Nathan's voice. Not similar to Nathan's voice, not a reasonable approximation. It was exactly Nathan's voice. Same tone, same cadence, same slight hoarseness from prolonged smoke exposure that I'd noticed during our evacuation attempt earlier that day. But Nathan was dead. I'd watched him burn alive in that truck less than 6 hours earlier. I opened the door and looked directly at the ranger's face under the porch light. It was Nathan's face. Not someone who looked like Nathan. Not a family resemblance or a coincidental similarity. It was exactly Nathan's face. Same brown eyes, same crooked nose from a childhood skateboard accident, same small crescent-shaped scar on his chin from falling off his bike when he was 7 years old. The uniform was completely correct. Proper patches in the right positions. Correct name tape reading N. Mills. Badge number that matched Nathan's service record exactly. But Nathan was dead. The fireball that had consumed his truck had been visible from 2 miles away. "There's been some kind of mistake," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I'm already evacuated. I'm staying at a motel in Cody, miles away from any fire zone." The ranger smiled Nathan's distinctive lopsided smile and consulted the papers on his clipboard with practiced efficiency. "Sir, our records indicate you were staying at a cabin in the Pahaska Creek drainage area. That entire region is now under mandatory evacuation due to rapidly changing fire conditions. I'm here to escort you to a designated evacuation center for your own safety. I left the cabin yesterday when the fire got close," I explained. "The whole area burned. My brother, the ranger who was helping coordinate the evacuation, he died in the fire when his truck crashed. I understand there may have been some confusion in the field," the ranger said patiently. "Emergency situations can be chaotic, and information doesn't always flow efficiently between different agencies and personnel. But I need you to come with me right now, sir, for your own safety and protection." Something was fundamentally wrong with the way he spoke. The words were Nathan's words, delivered in Nathan's exact voice and speech patterns, but the rhythm was slightly off somehow, like an actor who had memorized lines from a script but had never actually performed them in front of an audience before. The cadence was just a fraction of a beat too slow, the emphasis falling in places that didn't quite sound natural. "What's your full name and badge number?" I asked. "Ranger Nathan Mills, Shoshone National Forest, badge number 4729, he replied without hesitation. That was Nathan's badge number exactly. I knew it by heart because he'd carried the same number for 8 years. since his transfer from Yellowstone to the Shoshone district. But Nathan Mills was dead, burned alive in a truck washout, his remains probably still cooling in the blackened forest where I'd left him to die. "I need to see your official identification," I said. The ranger reached smoothly for his wallet and handed me a Forest Service identification card. The photograph was definitely Nathan's photograph, the same official headshot he'd had taken 2 years earlier when he renewed his credentials. The signature was Nathan's signature, the same careful handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas presents for 30 years. But something was wrong with the physical card itself. The lamination was too new, the edges too sharp and clean, like it had been printed that very morning rather than issued years earlier through normal bureaucratic channels. "Sir, we really need to get moving," the ranger said, a note of urgency creeping into Nathan's familiar voice. "The fire situation is deteriorating faster than our models predicted. Every minute we delay here puts you at significantly greater risk of being trapped by changing conditions." "Where exactly are we going?" I asked. "Which evacuation center?" "Secure designated facility," he replied, consulting his clipboard again and flipping through what appeared to be blank pages from my angle. "Remote location, well away from current and projected fire zones. Much safer than remaining here in town where conditions could change rapidly." "What's the specific address?" "What's the name of the facility?" The ranger paused for just a moment too long before answering. "It's a mobile command post, sir." "Better if I drive you there directly rather than trying to explain the route. These emergency facilities aren't always clearly marked on standard maps." That's when I noticed the vehicle he'd arrived in. It was parked in the motel lot under a streetlight. A white Forest Service pickup truck with proper emergency light arrays and correct agency markings painted on the doors. But something was wrong with the license plate. Nathan's official truck had Wyoming government plates with a specific alphanumeric sequence that started with the letters Y, followed by FS for Forest Service. This truck had Montana civilian plates, regular registration numbers that didn't match any government vehicle designation I'd ever seen. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said firmly. The ranger's smile widened significantly, showing far too many teeth. The corners of his mouth pulled back much further than Nathan's mouth had ever been able to stretch, creating an expression that was anatomically impossible for a normal human face. "Sir, this is a mandatory evacuation order issued under emergency authority. I'm legally authorized to use whatever force is necessary to ensure your compliance and safety." I stepped backward and started to push the door closed. The ranger moved forward with inhuman speed, much faster than any person should be able to react, and caught the heavy wooden door with his bare palm. The impact should have been painful, should have made him flinch or pull back instinctively. Instead, he held the door open against my full body weight with steady, effortless pressure, as if he were pushing against a piece of cardboard rather than solid oak. "We really need to leave immediately," he said, still using Nathan's voice perfectly, but his face was changing subtly as I watched. The basic features were still recognizably Nathan's features, but the proportions were shifting in ways that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The eyes were too far apart, the nose too narrow for the width of the face, the chin becoming too pointed and angular, like someone adjusting a digital photograph with editing software, stretching and distorting the image until it looked almost right but fundamentally wrong, in ways that triggered every evolutionary alarm system built into human psychology. I threw my entire body weight against the door and managed to force it closed, immediately turning the deadbolt and sliding the security chain into place. Then I grabbed my cell phone from the nightstand and tried to dial 911. The phone showed full signal strength, but somehow the call wouldn't connect. I got an error message I'd never seen before. "Emergency services temporarily unavailable in this area." I tried the landline phone next to the bed. No dial tone at all. Just empty silence. The ranger knocked again, much harder this time, hard enough that I could feel the vibrations through the door frame and into the floor. "Sir, please open this door immediately. This is for your own safety and protection." I looked through the peephole again. The ranger was still standing there under the porch light, but his face had changed even more dramatically. Still recognizably Nathan in the basic bone structure, but wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The eyes were now the wrong color entirely. Pale blue instead of Nathan's warm brown. The hair had the wrong texture, too coarse and thick. The skin looked stretched and artificial, like latex pulled over a framework that didn't quite fit properly. I grabbed my car keys and wallet and headed for the bathroom window at the back of the room. It was a small opening, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it opened onto a narrow service alley that ran behind the motel building, away from the main parking lot where the ranger's truck was positioned. I kicked out the screen and climbed through awkwardly, dropping about 4 feet into the alley between my motel and the building next door. My car was parked in the front lot, but walking around the building would mean exposing myself to whatever was wearing Nathan's face and trying to take me to an unknown location. Instead, I ran across the alley to a 24-hour truck stop diner that was still serving coffee and pie to long-haul drivers making their way across Wyoming during the cooler nighttime hours. I pushed through the front door and immediately said to the waitress behind the counter, "I need you to call the police right now. There's someone impersonating a Forest Service ranger trying to break into my motel room." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked at me with the expression people get when they're trying to decide if someone is drunk, crazy, or genuinely in distress. "Slow down, honey," she said gently. "Take a deep breath and tell me what's happening." I tried to explain as coherently as possible, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I realized how insane the whole story sounded. A dead ranger knocking on my door 6 hours after I'd watched him burn to death, asking me to go to an evacuation center that probably didn't exist, driving a truck with the wrong license plates, carrying identification that looked fake despite having all the correct information. The waitress listened patiently, nodding and making sympathetic noises, then gently suggested that I might be experiencing some kind of delayed stress reaction to the traumatic events I'd been through. "Shock can do funny things to a person's mind," she said kindly. "Maybe what you need is some hot coffee and a chance to call your family. Let them know you're safe. Sometimes our brains play tricks on us when we've been through something terrible." Through the diner's front windows, I could see the white Forest Service truck pulling slowly out of the motel parking lot, moving at an unnaturally steady pace down the main street. It paused directly in front of the diner for several long seconds, and I could see the driver's silhouette behind the wheel, turning his head to scan the windows methodically. His eyes caught the streetlight and reflected it back like an animal's eyes, bright and unnatural in the darkness. The truck moved on after what felt like an eternity, but I knew it would be back. I called a taxi from the diner's payphone and asked to be taken to the Greyhound bus station downtown. I bought a ticket on the first departure heading east. Didn't matter where it was going, just that it was leaving Cody and taking me away from whatever had been wearing my dead brother's face and trying to lure me away from safety. The bus pulled out at 6 a.m. sharp. I stayed awake for the entire 8-hour journey to Denver, constantly checking the highway behind us through the rear window, watching for white Forest Service trucks that never appeared. At the Denver terminal, I rented a car with cash and drove home to Colorado Springs using back roads and avoiding major highways, taking nearly twice as long as necessary but feeling safer away from main transportation routes. I called the Shoshone National Forest office the next morning and spoke directly to Nathan's district supervisor. I asked about evacuation follow-up procedures, about which rangers might be assigned to contact displaced residents who had been evacuated from fire zones. He told me categorically that no one from their office had been assigned to make contact with me, and that all evacuation assistance operations had been terminated once the immediate fire threat was contained. Besides, he added, we're operating with reduced personnel since we lost Nathan in that accident yesterday, Everyone who's left is pulling double shifts just to cover our basic administrative and patrol duties. I asked if any Forest Service vehicles had been reported stolen or missing from their fleet. He said no, but promised to check with neighboring districts and the state motor pool to see if any government vehicles were unaccounted for. He never called me back with any information. The official investigation concluded exactly what I'd expected it to conclude. Nathan died in a vehicle accident during emergency wildfire evacuation operations while attempting to escort a civilian to safety. His remains were recovered from the burned wreckage 3 days later, identified through dental records because there wasn't much else left to identify. The funeral was held the following weekend, closed casket service because of the extensive fire damage to his body. I spoke at the memorial service, telling carefully selected stories about Nathan's dedication to public safety, his love of wilderness areas, his commitment to protecting both natural resources and the people who visited them. I didn't mention the thing that had knocked on my motel room door wearing his face, speaking with his voice, trying to convince me to go with it to a safe location that almost certainly would have been anything but safe. But late at night, when I can't sleep and my mind wanders to dark places, I think about that ranger who appeared at my door, the way his smile stretched impossibly wide, the way his facial features shifted when I looked directly at them, the way he moved with inhuman speed and strength. Most of all, I think about what might have happened if I'd believed the evidence of my own eyes, if I'd trusted the familiar face and voice and gone with him willingly to whatever remote location he had in mind. I wonder what happened to the real Nathan's personal effects, his wallet and identification, the intimate details of his life that something else had somehow accessed and memorized perfectly. I wonder how long that thing had been studying my brother, learning his mannerisms and speech patterns, preparing to use his identity as a tool to manipulate people who trusted him. And I wonder how many other people it approached using Nathan's face, Nathan's voice, Nathan's authority as a Forest Service ranger. How many people might have gotten into that truck willingly, thinking they were being rescued by a competent professional who had their best interests at heart. I still do freelance writing, but I don't accept assignments that take me to remote locations anymore. I work from home, from coffee shops, from libraries, places with lots of people and witnesses and reliable cell phone service. I don't rent isolated cabins, and I sure as hell don't trust uniformed officials who show up at unexpected times with evacuation orders that don't make logical sense. Because I learned something that night in Cody that no emergency preparedness course teaches you. Something that would sound crazy if you tried to put it in an official safety manual. Sometimes the person wearing the official uniform isn't who they claim to be. Sometimes the familiar face asking for your cooperation belongs to something that has studied your loved one's appearance and mannerisms in microscopic detail. Something that can replicate their voice and appearance perfectly while having completely different intentions. Nathan died as a hero, doing exactly what Forest Service rangers are supposed to do, helping civilians evacuate from dangerous areas, putting their safety ahead of his own comfort and survival. But something else tried to use his heroic death as an opportunity, wearing his face and speaking with his voice to gain the trust of someone who cared about him, someone who would naturally want to cooperate with anything that looked and sounded like Nathan. If you're ever approached by an official during an emergency situation, especially if something feels even slightly wrong about the encounter, take the time to verify their identity through independent channels. Ask for supervisor contact information that you can call from a different phone. Request backup units or additional personnel. Most importantly, trust your instincts when they tell you something isn't right, even if the person looks exactly like someone you know and trust with your life. The real Nathan Mills died trying to save people from a wildfire, trapped in a vehicle accident while performing his duties as a public servant. The thing that wore his face and tried to take me to an unknown evacuation center. That was something else entirely. Something that understands how to exploit human trust and the natural impulse to cooperate with authority figures during crisis situations. I share this story not because I want attention or sympathy, but because I want people to understand that not every evacuation order is legitimate. Not every person in uniform has your best interests at heart, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust the evidence of your own eyes when every other instinct is screaming at you to run. Nathan would have wanted people to stay safe. He would have wanted them to ask hard questions, to verify official claims through proper channels, and to remember that real heroes don't come back from the dead to finish jobs they died trying to complete. Real heroes stay dead, and the people who love them have to find ways to live with that reality. If you've had similar experiences with questionable officials or people impersonating authority figures during emergencies, or if this account has helped you think more carefully about verifying official requests during crisis situations, I'd appreciate hearing about it in the comments section below. Share your experiences with others. Always verify emergency instructions through independent sources. And remember that sometimes the most helpful thing an official can do is prove they really are who they claim to be before asking you to trust them with your life. The search and rescue volunteer who found me after 3 days lost in the Cascade Wilderness had my father's voice, my father's mannerisms, and my father's way of calling my name. My father had been dead for 6 months. I should start with why I was out there alone in the first place, because that context matters for understanding what happened next. My father died of a heart attack in March, sudden and unexpected at 62 years old. He'd been planning a solo backpacking trip to the Olympic Peninsula for months, had all his permits secured, gear organized, maps annotated in his careful handwriting. After the funeral, I found his trip notes in his desk drawer. Detailed route plans, water sources, emergency contacts, everything organized the way he taught me to plan wilderness trips when I was growing up. 6 months later, in early September, I decided to take that trip myself. Not to the Olympics like he'd planned, but to the North Cascades where we'd hiked together when I was younger. Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, specifically the area around Cascade Pass and the Stehekin Valley. I told myself it was about honoring his memory, carrying forward his love of wilderness places, but really it was about grief processing and needing to be somewhere that felt connected to him. I planned a 4-day solo trip on the Cascade Pass Trail, starting from the Cascade River Road trailhead and hiking into the backcountry towards Sahalee Arm. Standard route, well-marked trail, moderate difficulty level. I'd done variations of this hike with my father at least a dozen times over the years, knew the terrain and the landmarks, felt comfortable with the logistics. I filed a trip plan with the ranger station, left detailed itinerary with my sister, packed 4 days of food plus 1-day emergency reserve. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy conditions, with possible afternoon thunderstorms. Typical September weather for the Cascades. I drove up Friday evening after work, slept in my car at the trailhead, and started hiking at first light Saturday morning. The trail climbs gradually through old-growth forest for the first few miles, crossing several creek beds and passing a series of small waterfalls. Familiar territory, exactly what I remembered from previous trips with my father. By mid-morning, I'd reached the first major viewpoint, where the trail emerges from dense timber onto open slopes with clear views of the surrounding peaks. Johannesburg Mountain to the south, Cascade Peak directly ahead, the whole dramatic landscape of jagged summits and hanging glaciers that makes this area famous among serious hikers. The weather was holding steady, scattered clouds but good visibility, perfect conditions for photography and route finding. I stopped for lunch at Cascade Pass itself, the high saddle that connects the Cascade River drainage with the Stehekin Valley on the east side. My father and I had eaten countless meals at this exact spot over the years, studying maps and planning extensions to our route, talking about wilderness philosophy and leave no trace principles. Being there alone felt strange but also appropriate, like completing something he'd started. That afternoon, I continued north toward Sahalee Arm, following the climber's trail that leads toward the base of Sahalee Peak. This is where the route becomes more demanding. leaving the maintained trail for rough cross-country travel over rocky terrain and seasonal snow patches. I'd done this section before, but always with my father as lead navigator, never solo. The landmarks looked different somehow, less obvious than I remembered them. Around 3 p.m., clouds began building rapidly from the west, the kind of weather change that happens fast in mountain environments. What had been scattered cumulus clouds became a solid overcast layer, then developed into a serious storm system with lightning and heavy rain. I took shelter under a large boulder and waited for the worst to pass, but the storm intensified rather than moving through quickly. By 5 p.m. I was hiking in near whiteout conditions. Heavy rain mixed with sleet, visibility reduced to maybe 20 feet in any direction. The rough trail I'd been following became increasingly difficult to identify, just occasional cairns and boot prints on wet rock. I reached what I thought was a familiar landmark, a small tarn surrounded by stunted alpine trees, but it didn't match my mental map of the area. That's when I made the critical mistake. Instead of staying put and waiting for conditions to improve, I decided to push forward and try to reach my planned campsite before dark. I convinced myself that I knew the route well enough to navigate in poor visibility, that I could follow the terrain features and dead reckon my way to the designated camping area. Classic case of summit fever, the kind of decision-making error that gets people into serious trouble in the mountains. I left the vicinity of the tarn and headed northeast, following what appeared to be a used trail through scattered timber and across several small stream crossings. But within an hour I was completely disoriented, surrounded by terrain that didn't match anything from my previous experience in this area. The GPS unit in my pack showed my location as a coordinate pair, but the surrounding landscape didn't correspond to anything on my topographic map. Darkness fell early under the heavy cloud cover, and I was forced to make an emergency bivouac in less than ideal conditions. I found a marginally sheltered spot under a cluster of subalpine firs, set up my lightweight tent on uneven ground, and spent a miserable night listening to rain and wind while trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. My sleeping bag stayed reasonably dry, but everything else was soaked through. Sunday morning brought no improvement in weather conditions. Dense fog had replaced the rain, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet and making navigation even more challenging than it had been the day before. I packed up wet gear and tried to retrace my route from the previous afternoon, looking for recognizable landmarks or the trail I'd lost, but everything looked different in the fog, and I couldn't locate any of the features I remembered passing. I spent the entire day wandering through unfamiliar terrain, following game trails that led nowhere, crossing and recrossing the same creek systems without finding anything that matched my maps. My GPS showed I was moving in rough circles, never more than a mile or two from where I'd started that morning, but the actual landscape remained completely foreign. Late Sunday, I made another cold camp in the fog, eating trail food and trying to conserve battery power on my electronics. Monday was worse. The fog had developed into a temperature inversion, a thick blanket of low clouds that completely obscured all visual references above about 6,000 feet elevation. I could hear aircraft passing overhead occasionally, probably Coast Guard or Forest Service flights, but they couldn't see me through the cloud layer and I had no way to signal them effectively. I was starting to acknowledge the seriousness of my situation, lost for 2 full days in challenging terrain, weather conditions preventing both self-rescue and outside assistance, food supplies running lower than I'd planned. I still had water from natural sources, but my high-energy food was nearly gone, and I was beginning to feel the physical effects of inadequate calorie intake combined with the stress of being lost. That evening, I found a more substantial shelter under a rock overhang, and made the decision to stay put rather than continuing to wander randomly. I set up my emergency signal mirror and whistle where they'd be easily accessible, organized my remaining food to make it last as long as possible, and tried to calculate how long I could survive if rescue didn't come soon. The math wasn't encouraging. Tuesday morning, the fog finally began to lift, revealing terrain that was completely unfamiliar despite being within a few miles of areas I'd hiked dozens of times. I could see peaks and ridgelines, but they didn't form the expected patterns, didn't match the views I remembered from previous trips. It was as if I'd been transported to a different mountain range entirely, someplace with similar vegetation and geology but completely different topography. I climbed to the highest available viewpoint and tried to identify landmarks using my map and compass, but nothing lined up correctly. The peaks I could see were the wrong shapes, in the wrong positions relative to each other. Either my navigation skills were much worse than I'd thought, or something very strange was happening with my perception of the landscape. That afternoon I heard voices calling in the distance, human voices rather than wildlife sounds. I responded immediately with my emergency whistle. 3 sharp blasts repeated at regular intervals, the standard distress signal. The calling continued, coming from different directions, and I could make out individual words echoing off the rock faces around me. "Can you hear me?" came the first clear phrase, shouted from somewhere below my position. "We're here to help you," I shouted back as loudly as possible, identifying myself by name and explaining that I'd been lost since Saturday afternoon, that I needed assistance with navigation back to the main trail system. The voices responded positively, saying they were search and rescue volunteers who had been looking for me, that they would guide me to safety. But something about the voices bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately identify. They sounded familiar, not just in the sense of speaking English in recognizable accents, but familiar in a more personal way, like voices I'd heard before in different contexts, voices that belonged to people I knew rather than strangers who happened to be helping with a rescue operation. "Stay where you are," called one of the voices. "We're coming to you." That voice was my father's voice, not similar to my father's voice, not someone with a comparable tone and accent. It was exactly my father's voice, with the same slight hoarseness he developed in his later years, the same way of emphasizing certain syllables when he was trying to project over distance. But my father was dead, had been dead for 6 months, buried in a cemetery in suburban Seattle while I was struggling to navigate grief and loss. I told myself I was experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by stress, dehydration, and sleep deprivation. People lost in wilderness areas commonly report hearing familiar voices, seeing familiar faces, experiencing false perceptions that their minds create as coping mechanisms during extreme situations. It made sense that my subconscious would conjure up my father's voice during a crisis, especially since we'd hiked together in similar terrain so many times over the years. But then I heard my father call my name in the exact tone he'd used when I was a kid and had wandered too far from our campsite. "Come back toward my voice," he called. "Follow the sound and I'll guide you to where you need to be." I started moving in the direction of the voice, picking my way carefully down a steep slope covered with loose rock and alpine vegetation. The terrain was treacherous, requiring constant attention to foot placement and handholds, but I could hear my father's voice providing encouragement and direction from somewhere ahead. "That's good," the voice said. "Keep coming this way. Watch your footing on those wet rocks." It was exactly the kind of guidance my father had given me on countless hiking trips, the same patient tone he used when teaching me technical skills or helping me navigate challenging terrain. The cadence and word choice were so familiar that I found myself responding automatically, following his directions without conscious thought, falling back into the old pattern of letting him lead while I focused on the immediate task of safe movement. After 20 minutes of careful descent, I reached a more level area where the vegetation transitioned from alpine scrub to mature forest. The fog was patchy here, creating pockets of visibility separated by areas of dense mist. I could see boot prints in the soft soil, evidence of other hikers who had passed through recently. "Over here," my father's voice called from a cluster of large Douglas firs about 50 yards away. "I can see you now. You're doing fine." I moved toward the voice and saw a figure standing in the partial shade between the tree trunks. Average height, familiar build, wearing standard hiking gear, backpack, rain jacket, hiking boots, baseball cap pulled low over his face. The posture was unmistakably my father's posture. The way he stood with slightly slumped shoulders and hands hanging loose at his sides. Weight shifted to his right foot to compensate for an old knee injury, but as I got closer, something felt wrong about the whole situation. The figure didn't move naturally, didn't shift weight or adjust position the way a living person does unconsciously. He stood perfectly still, like a photograph rather than a human being. And when he spoke, his mouth didn't quite synchronize with the words I was hearing. "You've been lost for a while," the figure said in my father's voice. "But don't worry. I know exactly where we are and how to get you back to safety. Just follow me and stay close." The face under the baseball cap was my father's face. Same weathered features, same gray beard, same brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But something was off about the proportions, as if someone had created a wax sculpture using accurate measurements, but hadn't quite captured the way all the features worked together. The smile was too wide, showing too many teeth, and the eyes didn't track properly when the head moved. "Dad?" I said, knowing it was impossible but unable to process what I was seeing any other way. "I'm here to help you," the figure replied. "I know you're confused and scared, but everything's going to be all right. I know these mountains better than anyone, and I'll get you home safely." It was exactly what my father would have said in this situation, delivered in his characteristic calm and reassuring tone. But my father was dead, and this thing wearing his appearance was something else entirely. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain weather, a deep, visceral fear that made every survival instinct I possessed scream warnings. "Show me some identification," I said, backing away slowly. "Prove you're really search and rescue." The figure reached into a pocket and pulled out what appeared to be an official volunteer SAR credential, the kind of laminated card that rescue personnel carry to identify themselves to lost hikers and law enforcement. But when I looked closely, the details were wrong. The photo showed my father's face, but it was an old photo from maybe 15 years earlier. The name read Robert Mills, which was my father's name, but the organization was listed as Cascade County Search and Rescue, which didn't exist in this area. "The important thing," the figure said, "is getting you out of here before weather conditions deteriorate further. I know a route that will have you back to the trailhead parking area within a few hours." He gestured toward what appeared to be a well-used trail leading deeper into the forest, away from the direction I'd been trying to go. Everything in my experience told me that the main trail system lay to the south and west, back toward the Cascade River drainage where I'd started my hike. But this figure was suggesting we head north and east, further into wilderness areas that would be harder to reach, and more difficult for real rescue personnel to access. "That doesn't seem like the right direction," I said. "According to my map, the trailhead should be that way." I pointed southwest, toward where I believed the Cascade River Road should be located. "Maps can be misleading in this terrain," the figure replied patiently. "I've been searching these mountains for 30 years. Trust me, I know the fastest route back to civilization." That phrase triggered a memory. 30 years was exactly how long my father had been hiking in the Cascades, from the time he'd moved to Washington State in his early 30s until his death the previous spring. It was the kind of detail that someone would need intimate knowledge of his personal history to know, not something a stranger would guess correctly. "How do you know about my father's hiking experience?" I asked. The figure smiled that too wide smile again. "Because I am your father. I know it's difficult to understand, but I've been given a chance to help you one more time, to make sure you get home safely from these mountains we both loved so much." It was a compelling explanation, exactly the kind of supernatural intervention that grief makes you want to believe in. But everything rational in my mind rejected it completely. My father was dead, buried, gone. This thing might look like him and sound like him, but it was something else using his appearance to manipulate me into going somewhere I shouldn't go. "If you're really my father," I said, "then tell me something only he would know. Something personal that nobody else could guess." The figure paused for a moment, head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if accessing information from some internal database. "When you were 12 years old," it said finally, "you got lost on Mount Pilchuck during a day hike. You panicked and left the trail, and I had to track you for 3 hours before I found you crying under a fallen cedar tree. I carried you on my shoulders for the last 2 miles back to the car." That memory was completely accurate, down to specific details I'd never shared with anyone else. It had been one of the most frightening experiences of my childhood, and also one of the moments that had taught me the most about wilderness navigation and the importance of staying calm during emergencies. But it was also exactly the kind of memory that something studying my personal history could access. If it had the right sources of information, anyone could have learned that story, I said. My mother, my sister, family, friends. That's not proof of anything. The figure's expression shifted subtly, the smile becoming less natural and more forced. "You're being unnecessarily suspicious," it said in my father's voice. "I understand you're stressed and disoriented, but I'm here to help you. Fighting me will only make this situation more dangerous for both of us." There was a subtle threat in those words that my father would never have used. My father had been patient and supportive, never manipulative or coercive, even during the most difficult moments of my adolescence. This thing was using his appearance and voice, but the personality underneath was something different, something that didn't understand how my father actually communicated with people he loved. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, continuing to back away. "Real search and rescue teams work in groups, carry radios, coordinate with incident commanders. You're out here alone, with no communication equipment, trying to lead me away from where help would actually come from." The figure's face began changing as I watched, still recognizably my father, but with features that shifted in subtle ways. The eyes became paler, almost colorless. The skin took on a waxy texture that didn't look entirely human. The smile stretched wider than any human mouth should be able to stretch, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," it said, still using my father's voice but with an undertone of something cold and predatory. "I know exactly where you need to go, and I'm going to take you there whether you cooperate or not." I turned and ran. The terrain was steep and treacherous, covered with loose rock and slippery vegetation, exactly the kind of ground where running is dangerous and likely to result in serious injury. But staying near that thing felt infinitely more dangerous than risking a fall, so I pushed through the brush as fast as I could manage, using tree branches for support and trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had been wearing my father's face. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, but not the sound of another human crashing through the underbrush. Instead, there was a strange sliding noise, like something large moving through the forest without regard for obstacles, accompanied by my father's voice calling my name with increasing urgency and anger. "Come back here," the voice called. "You're going to get hurt running through terrain like this. I'm only trying to help you get home safely." But the tone was wrong now, more demanding than concerned, lacking the genuine worry that would have characterized my father's response to seeing someone he loved in danger. It sounded like an actor who was getting tired of maintaining a performance, letting his real personality show through the facade. I ran for maybe 20 minutes, until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Then I found a hiding place behind a large boulder and tried to catch my breath while listening for signs of continued pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet, no bird songs or insect sounds, just the whisper of wind through the canopy and the distant sound of running water. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, I heard helicopters approaching from the west. Real helicopters, with the distinctive sound of military or search and rescue aircraft rather than the civilian traffic that occasionally passed over wilderness areas. I emerged from my hiding place and tried to signal them with my emergency mirror, angling reflected sunlight toward the aircraft. One of the helicopters changed course and began circling my general area, obviously searching for someone on the ground. I continued signaling while moving toward the largest available clearing, where they might be able to see me directly or attempt a landing if the terrain permitted. Within minutes, I could see crew members looking down from the open doors of the aircraft, and one of them was pointing in my direction. The helicopter couldn't land due to the rough terrain and dense tree cover, but they lowered a rescue basket on a cable and extracted me to a staging area about 5 miles away, where paramedics checked me for injuries and dehydration, while law enforcement officers took my statement about being lost since Saturday afternoon. The King County Sheriff's deputy who interviewed me was professional and thorough, documenting the timeline of my hike, the weather conditions I'd encountered, and the route I'd attempted to follow. When he asked if I'd seen any other people during my time in the wilderness, I hesitated for a long moment before answering. I thought I saw someone who looked like a search and rescue volunteer, I said finally. But when I got closer, something seemed off about him. Wrong equipment, wrong procedures. I decided not to approach. The deputy nodded and made notes. "Smart decision," he said. "We get reports of people impersonating rescue personnel, usually someone with mental health issues trying to be helpful but actually creating more problems. Always good to verify credentials before following anyone into unfamiliar territory." I didn't mention that the impersonator had looked exactly like my dead father, had known personal details from my childhood, had tried to lead me away from the areas where real rescue teams would be searching. That level of detail would have raised questions about my mental state, questions that might have resulted in psychological evaluation rather than simple rescue and return to civilization. The helicopter flew me back to the Cascade River Road trailhead, where my car was still parked exactly where I'd left it 4 days earlier. My sister was waiting there, having been contacted by the sheriff's office when my overdue status triggered a formal search and rescue operation. She drove me home while I sat in the passenger seat trying to process what had happened in those mountains. That night, I called the Cascade County Sheriff's Office and asked if they had any record of volunteer search and rescue personnel operating in the area where I'd been lost. The dispatcher told me that all SAR operations were coordinated through their office, and that no volunteers had been deployed to search for me until Tuesday morning, when the weather cleared enough for safe helicopter operations. Besides, she added, "We don't have anyone named Robert Mills on our volunteer roster. Are you sure about the name?" I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I was sure that something wearing my father's appearance had tried to lead me away from safety, away from the areas where real help might find me, toward some unknown destination in the deep wilderness where no one would think to look for missing hikers. I've returned to the North Cascades several times since then, but never alone, and never to the area where I was lost that September. When I hike with friends or family members, I always carry redundant navigation equipment, file detailed trip plans, and maintain regular check-in schedules with people who will notice if I don't return on time. And I've stopped visiting my father's grave, stopped talking to him during quiet moments when grief makes me want to believe he might somehow still be listening. Because I learned something in those mountains that changed my understanding of how the world works, something that no wilderness survival course prepares you for. Sometimes the familiar voice calling your name from the darkness doesn't belong to someone who loves you and wants to keep you safe. Sometimes it belongs to something that has studied the people you trust, learned their mannerisms and speech patterns, and uses that knowledge to manipulate you into making dangerous decisions. My father died of a heart attack in suburban Seattle, surrounded by paramedics and hospital equipment, fighting to stay alive until the very end. He didn't get a chance to save me one more time, didn't receive some supernatural opportunity to guide me through the wilderness we'd explored together. He stayed dead, the way dead people do, while something else borrowed his appearance to serve its own purposes. If you're ever approached by someone offering help in an emergency situation, especially in remote areas where official rescue services would be difficult to coordinate, take the time to verify their identity and credentials through independent sources. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if the person looks and sounds like someone you would normally trust with your life. Real search and rescue personnel work in teams, carry proper equipment, and coordinate with incident command structures that can be verified through official channels. They don't appear alone in the wilderness wearing familiar faces, trying to lead you away from areas where other people might find you. The mountains are dangerous enough without adding human predators who understand how to exploit grief and trust, and the natural impulse to follow familiar voices toward what seems like safety. Stay alert, verify everything, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous person in the wilderness is the one who seems most helpful and familiar. If you've had similar experiences with questionable rescue personnel or people claiming to help during outdoor emergencies, or if this account has made you think more carefully about verifying assistance in remote areas, I'd appreciate hearing about it in the comments. Share your experiences. Always verify official help through proper channels. And remember that real rescue operations follow established protocols that can be confirmed through multiple sources. Your safety depends on maintaining healthy skepticism, even when someone appears who looks exactly like a person you trust with your life.